front with China, as Chinese officials reaffirmed their commitment to global supply chain stability and cooperation on export controls. At a press conference, the Foreign Ministry of China said that the nation's rare earths policy remains in line with international norms and that it's ready to deepen dialogue with relevant countries, including the European Union. This comes ahead of the World AI Conference in Shanghai, where Premier Li Qiang is set to deliver the opening speech this weekend. Meanwhile, at a 10th summit in Beijing, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called for a rebalancing of trade, warning that the bloc's €300 billion trade deficit with China is no longer sustainable. Von der Leyen said EU-China ties are at an inflection point and urged Beijing to address industrial overcapacity and concerns about its support for Russia's wartime economy. Well, joining us on the programme to look at both of these points, EU-China relations and this upcoming summit with Li Qiang present, Jayjit Bhattacharya, an economist and finance expert. Thank you very much for being here with us. Let's first look at this summit and these conversations that are taking place between the EU and China. That meeting taking place earlier today, Ursula von der Leyen, Antonio Costa, President Xi. This is a clear rhetoric coming from the EU, one that mirrors that of the US administration, talking about that imbalance, talking about the amounts of production going on in China and the lack of consumption going on. The EU now repeating this. Can you provide some context around what this actually means for the everyday consumer and both countries economically?
Clearly there is a humongous amount of capacity in China. And what has happened post-COVID is a realization that China could weaponize that capacity because China cut off that capacity access to the rest of the world during COVID. In fact, even factories that were owned by non-Chinese, such as the Europeans and the Americans, the Chinese government stopped the upliftment of those outputs to countries outside of China. It was blockaded. And therefore, there is a significant concern around that, which is why the US took the lead in creating what is called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to be able to create resilient supply chains. Now, this current conversation between the EU and China is going to possibly lead to some assuance because if not China, then where is the question? How can you quickly relocate capacities from China to outside? These are question marks given the larger disruption in trade that is happening, which is hurting everyone, including China. Also, one of the side effects of this phenomena where people are not buying from China, and by people I mean EU and the US, is that the excess capacity is being dumped in economies such as India, which is decimating the domestic capacities. And therefore, even though the consumers may be getting some of the goods at a smaller price, at a lower price, but that's a short-term effect. In the longer term, it'll come back to bite us the same way that China played around with antibiotics, with penicillin G, where they dropped the prices till the time the domestic capacities were removed, and then the prices came back much more than what they were earlier. So that's the repercussion that economies such as India and others will be facing. And therefore, it's perhaps in everyone's interest that we stitch back the trade regime that existed, and therefore the EU-China trade negotiations and discussions are very, very important.
Yes, absolutely. And those discussions are continuing. Just very briefly, looking at that US-China relationship, we have a very short amount of time, but do you think that the positive conversation that has been had publicly by the United States is going to help China's standings in these discussions with groups like the EU and other trading partners?
Well, even the US-China discussions were quite complex because at the end of the day, it was US which blinked first in terms of who has a higher capacity to withstand the economic pain. But what came out of the US-China negotiations was also the fact that there is significant tariffs now on all of Chinese products landing in the US market. And therefore, China would like to diversify and have greater access to the EU market as a hedge against the US market, which seems to be a little fickle in terms of the ability to access that market. And therefore, the US-China agreement will have a long shadow on the EU-China discussions that's going on.
Yes, Jajit Bhattacharya, thank you ever so much for joining us and providing that insight, something we will continue to monitor as trade tensions come closer towards that 1st of August deadline, and discussions amongst other trade partners, not including the US, continue to take place. But talking of the US, let's now head over